Good morning, everybody. Today is Thursday, the 4th of February. Sometimes Thursdays are called Thoughtful Thursdays. I'm going to read you a story today, and it's not Millie Molly Mandy, although I know lots of you absolutely love Millie Molly Mandy. Today's story is by Lauren Child, and it is Hubert Horatio Bartle Bobton-Trent. That's quite difficult to say. I'm going to have another go at that. Hubert Horatio Bartle Bobton-Trent by Lauren Child. You might know Lauren Child. She also wrote Charlie and Lola books. When my children, who are quite big now, were little, they used to love Lauren Child's books, Charlie and Lola, and they also really used to like this book. I know it's going to be a bit difficult to see the pictures, but I'm going to try my best to show you the pictures as we go through. But if we miss any, when we're all back together in school, you can definitely borrow this book and have a closer look at the illustrations. So here we go. Let's have a look at this story by Lauren Child. Mr. and Mrs. Barton Bobton-Trent were frightfully rich. They lived in a large luxury house in London, a swankily swell house in New York, and a marvellously marble house in Milan. I love that alliteration, all the letters the same at the first sound of each word. They took trips here, they took trips there, and trips everywhere that you could possibly take a trip to. They bought anything they could think of. They bought rare rugs, tiny televisions, crocheted cushions, tailored trousers, plush pajamas, abstract art, china curiosities, posh pets, pungent plants, and strangely shaped swimming pools. They went out to dinner almost every single night for two, for 12, for 202. They dined with the President. They dined with the Prime Minister and the Queen. They knew everyone who is anyone, and they knew everybody. But after a while, they began to tire of the same old places and faces, and they wanted to meet someone new. And so they had a child. Mr. and Mrs. Bobton-Trent were delighted with him when he arrived, and they named him Hubert Horatio Bartle Bobton-Trent. Most people just called him Hubert Horatio Bobton-Trent for short, or sometimes just Hubert Horatio for extra short. But his parents simply called him H because he could never quite remember the whole thing. Remembering things was never their strong point. One day, when Hubert felt he was old enough to tell his parents he did not like to be called H, he telephoned down to the drawing room where his parents were doing some light entertaining with the Elfington Learys. Light entertaining with the Elfington Learys. How splendid. This was when everyone realised that the 1-year-old Hubert Horatio could not only speak, he could also use the telephone at 1 year old. Oh, and have a little look, because I love this picture. They are playing Twister. Could use a telephone. When Hubert was 2, Mrs. Bobton-Trent, unable to find a blanket, tucked him under a copy of the Whispering Weekly, her favourite gossip magazine. Upon waking, Hubert read the magazine twice, front to back, and once back to front. This was when Hubert found out he was a pretty good reader. 1 year later, when the Bobton-Trents were engaged in a furious game of dominoes with their dear friends and next-door neighbours, the Davenport Martins, Hubert Horatio fell into the swimming pool. Look at the boomerang-shaped swimming pool. This was when 3-year-old Hubert Horatio discovered he was a natural swimmer at the age of 3. In fact, Hubert Horatio Bartle Bobton-Trent was a natural at almost everything, with the notable exception of flower arranging and cake baking. He really had to work rather hard at those skills, baking and making cakes. Hubert very much enjoyed the company of his parents, and every evening at bedtime he would join them for cocoa by making his way down 3 flights of stairs, left past the marble bust of Madame Marchapello, along the East Wing corridor, right at the potted plant, up the flight of stairs, and then 3 small steps to his parents' bedroom door. And his cocoa was always just a little cold by the time he got there, as you can well imagine, because it's a very, very big house. Usually he found his parents playing Monopoly in their gym jams. It actually says pyjamas, but I like the word gym jams, in their pyjamas. The game very seriously and seldom played without real money. All 3 Bobton-Trents were devoted games players and committed cocoa drinkers. Here they are in their matching pyjamas. Over the wall in the next door mansion lived the St. Bernards, pronounced Bernard, the St. Bernard. The emphasis on the nard, it says here. Like Mr. and Mrs. Barton-Trent, the St. Bernards had one son who was a child genius. He was called Stanton Harcourt III and was Hubert's best friend and keen table tennis enthusiast. Stanton Harcourt III was exactly as bright as Hubert Horatio Herbert Bobton-Trent. So together, the 2 of them were probably the most brainy persons in whatever country they happened to be in at the time. Very brainy, very bright, very good at table tennis. Hubert and Stanton Harcourt III liked to spend their time concocting experiments and discovering formulas in their homemade laboratory. Sometimes, just for the fun of it, they would multiply tricky fractions and then divide them by the square root of different digits. Other times they would quiz each other on obscure Japanese vocabulary. When they were not doing this, they were playing table tennis. One Tuesday, Herbert returned from school to find an invitation from his parents which said, "Dearest H, we are throwing an enormous party and inviting absolutely everyone we have ever met and some we haven't even met. Please join us in the ballroom. With love, your parents." Hubert already always enjoyed these parties as he was an exuberant dancer. However, on this occasion, something very odd occurred. Halfway through the party, they ran out of jelly. This was highly unusual. Hubert's parents never ran out of anything. Well, the next strange thing happened when Hubert and Harcourt were on the roof counting moon craters at dawn. They noticed Mr. Grimshaw, the butler, handing the milkman a priceless portrait of Mr. Bobton-Trent's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather in exchange for 2 pints of milk. Very strange indeed. A few evenings later, Mr. and Mrs. Bobton-Trent were entertaining the Butterworth Trotters and eagerly waiting for Martha, the maid, to serve them the sautéed scallops. After nearly 1 hour and 22 minutes, no food appeared. Mr. Bobton-Trent said, "Where on earth do you think Martha might be?" Hubert Horatio quietly slipped off his chair and went to investigate. In the kitchen he found Mr. Grimshaw the butler eating cheddar cheese and stale bread. Mr. Grimshaw explained that unfortunately the chef had resigned due to the lack of ingredients. Martha and all the other staff had left due to the fact they hadn't been paid for 2 years, and that he himself would have to resign if he didn't get paid by 9 o'clock the next morning. The immediate problem, however, was what to feed the guests. So this was solved by Hubert, who was a creative chef, and he quickly rustled up cheese on toast for 4, which was delicious. After serving it to his parents and guests, he went off to his room to see what funds he had in his personal piggy bank. There turned out to be no more than a paper clip and a slightly hairy cough drop. It dawned on Hubert that the Bobton-Trents' fortune was in a bad way, i.e., there was no money left. Cleverly, Hubert managed to sell a slightly broken table tennis bat, an ugly bedside lamp, and some back issues of the Whispering Weekly over the phone to his friend Elliot Snidge Combe, thus giving him enough cash to pay Mr. Grimshaw's wages. That night, unable to sleep, Hubert telephoned his best friend and algebra partner for some financial advice. After some 5.33 minutes of calculation, Stanton Harcourt announced that the only sensible way out of this financial ruin was to sell the family home. Hubert Horatio was horrified. His parents loved their beautiful mansion. How would they cope if they found out they were no longer frightfully rich? What would happen to Mr. Grimshaw? And in any case, where would they put the table tennis table? The following morning, they came up with an ingenious solution. They decided to enter Mr. and Mrs. Bobton-Trent into various games competitions. Hubert's parents were champions of Chinese checkers and could beat anyone on the Scrabble board. But Boggle was where they were really excellent. They won everything. The problem was getting them to be sensible with the prize money. More often than not, the Bobton-Trents would celebrate their win by taking all the other contestants out for dinner. It was finally Stanton Harcourt who came up with the second brilliant plan. With Mr. Grimshaw's help, the two boys sold tickets and the Bobton-Trents' house was open to the public. Hubert's parents were astonished when suddenly their afternoon game of tiddlywinks was interrupted by a party of sightseers having a good old time around their home. Unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Bobton-Trent were delighted by the unexpected guests, so much so that they invited them back the following week, and of course it added up to several hundred people. And just the tea alone for several hundred people adds up to several £100. Before Hubert and Stanton knew it, all the profit from their ticket sales had gone. It seemed, after all, there was only one solution. It was with a heavy heart that Hubert Horatio finally asked Mr. Grimshaw to drive himself and Stanton Harcourt to the estate agents. After several nail-biting seconds, the agent said that he might have a home that the Bobton-Trents could afford, which was excitingly called 17B Plankton Heights. With great trepidation, Hubert went home to tell his parents the unfortunate news. But what a surprise! Can you see that big, beautiful block of flats? Mr. and Mrs. Bobton-Trent liked it at once, for it had a great view, and for another, all the rooms were on the same floor, which was perfect. Mr. and Mrs. Bobton-Trent loved that there was always someone available to play Kerplunk. Mr. Bobton-Trent started his career as a doorman, a job perfectly suited to his social skills. Mr. Grimshaw retained his job of butler, taking care of all the residents. And Hubert and Stanton Harcourt III found the perfect place for the table tennis table. Hubert's parents said, "Hubert Horatio Bartle Bobton-Trent, you are a genius for moving us here. We have never been so happy." And Hubert, realizing that being frightfully, frightfully rich was not frightfully, frightfully important after all. And, and, for the first time ever, Hubert Horatio's cocoa was still warm by the time he had walked the short distance from his own bedroom to his parents' bedroom to say good night. Warm cocoa at the end of the day. Probably better than anything. So, that's the end of today's story. And I think there's a lovely message in there about being grateful for what you have. Because whether you live in a palace, whether you live in a castle, whether you live in a mansion, whether you live in a tent or a teepee or an ordinary house, it's being with your mum or being with your dad or being with your mum and dad or being with your grandma or being with your aunt or being with your brothers and sisters or your pets or your goldfish or your hamster or your goldfish. Did I say goldfish? Or your parrot. That's what makes a home. It's not about having lots of Monopoly sets or lots of posh pictures on the wall or marvelous shaped swimming pools. It's about love and cocoa. Love and cocoa. I hope you enjoyed this story. Have a lovely weekend when you get to it, and I'll see you soon. Bye.